One example is for instance, with a Gulfstream G650. The aircraft weighs over 100,000 pounds, but there are some airports that limit noise restrictions or weight restrictions. So the way the type certificate holder, Gulfstream, manages that is you can embody what are referred to as aircraft service changes. And all the aircraft service change is there's a placard holder in the cockpit that maintenance installs, and then they make a record of that placard holder being installed. Well, the placard holder is part of one of several aircraft service changes that also include a placard. So with that aircraft, if the owner of the aircraft wants to go into an airport that has a restricted weight on the airfield, all the pilot has to do is take the placard that says that the maximum operational weight is 96,000 or 99,500 pounds and install that placard there and fly the aircraft to that limitation. That's as simple as it is. However, you've changed the configuration of the aircraft. There has to be a record in the technical record that the aircraft configuration has changed, and now the maximum limit and maximum weight on that aircraft is 99,500.
Hi everyone, I'm Annalisa from C.A.C. Global Solutions. Welcome to our YouTube channel and welcome to another episode of Storytime with Bret, where I speak with Bret about some experiences that he had as an aircraft maintenance engineer, aviation consultant, and civil aviation and worthiness inspector. So today we are going to talk about configuration changes. So, Bret, would you like to start this topic, just giving us an idea, what do you mean with configuration changes?
Yeah, thanks, Annalisa. I think you're right. Some background here helps a little bit in getting into the examples that I'll give as stories. But configuration changes basically are when an aircraft is delivered new, it has to meet type certification. And also there are completion items that become part of the definition for that aircraft. And those are what's considered the configuration for the aircraft. So any completion items, any modifications, options, anything that was required for type, it all gets rolled into one definition, and that's the aircraft's configuration. So a couple of things about configuration changes. So some of them are more permanent than others. Some are very simple changes. They can be as simple as placard change. They can be as complicated as a freighter or passenger to freighter conversion. So of course, the passenger to freighter conversion would be an example of a permanent change. Another example of a permanent change would be the Convair 580. They stretch it, they call it the Convair stretch, or the 5800. This is where they actually extend the fuselage, change the engines, the propellers, avionics package. I mean, it's a very comprehensive change. And typically the more permanent changes are quite comprehensive. And then we have some kind of hybrid changes that might require permanent fixtures attached to the aircraft, fittings for attaching roll equipment or things of that nature. But yet, after the initial installation, they become more of just a simple roll equipment change item. So, for instance, installing baskets on a helicopter initially might require some hard point attachments, structural attachments, but after that, it may simply be a matter of installing pins to hold the baskets in place or removing the pins to remove the basket. Very simple changes, but nonetheless, those are still considered changes. Then we've got some roll equipment changes that are very basic, like where you have a medevac aircraft, fixed wing or helicopter, where they have the ability to remove seats simply by the quick attachment points, typically in what's referred to as a brown line on the floor of the aircraft, or installation of stretchers or things of that nature or cargo nets, for instance, for hauling freight, right? Finally, the most simple one is where very simple changes are required. It might be installation of a flight manual supplement, or it might mean the installation of a removable placard in the cockpit, anything of that nature. So we've got a whole gamut of them. And the reason I mean, we're going to give examples of things that I think we've both seen, and how they affect the aircraft. But a couple of things that are common to all of these, and this is important for anybody flying the aircraft or maintainer embodying the aircraft, or certainly continuing airworthiness people that are considering these aspects in the embodiment of, or maintenance of an aircraft, is that anytime the configuration changes on an aircraft, it doesn't matter the nature of the configuration, but anytime the configuration changes, there needs to be a record of that change made in the technical record of the aircraft. And then the technical record of the aircraft may be comprised of different items. You know, the aircraft flight manual may need changes embodied, supplements inserted, the weight and balance might need to be changed, the configuration list or the equipment list might need to be amended, might even affect the electrical load analysis for an aircraft. So there are a number of aspects that have to be considered from an airworthiness perspective, that when considering embodying any of these changes, from a maintenance perspective, when you're actually embodying them, but also from a flight operations standpoint, particularly with role changes. In a lot of instances, regulations allow a pilot to make very simple changes to an aircraft, perform very simple maintenance tasks or work tasks. Now, each person would have to check with their regulation to see if they're in fact allowed to make these changes. And it might be so that they are allowed to make the change, but they have to receive some sort of training or authorization or whatever the case might be. So that's a very important aspect to remember about this. So, and like I said, so there has to be a record of the change in the technical record of the aircraft, and all of the supporting documentation has to be with the aircraft. Now, another commonality of configuration changes is that all of the data that will be used or can be used has to be approved or specified data. It has to be acceptable to the authority under which the aircraft is registered. So in some instances, that might be a supplemental type certificate. Other instances, it might be simple as the maintenance manual allows roll equipment changes as different options for the aircraft. And in either of these instances, that there has to be data that exists to support the change of configuration to the aircraft. So
I would like to I would like to make a comment on this technical records part, because I think it's extremely important. Because like we were talking about just before we got into this discussion in this video, I was telling you that, you know, I'm when I started my career, I started as in an airline. So for me, when you say configuration changes, for me it's big STC, right? And then when I had to manage like helicopters, where that have a lot of different kits, that things changed. So I had to change my mindset, and also the way you manage those things are slightly different. So in terms of technical records, I just would like to point out two aspects. First of all, there is the need for to record these changes in the technical records, and then sometimes is a work order where you write down that the STC 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 has been embodied. But also in other cases, like with kits, again, for helicopters, like bearpaws or baskets or flotations, those are things that, like you were saying, they can be installed and removed very, very quickly and very easily. But still, you need to report in the technical record, which in this case might simply be the flight technical log, that action has been accomplished, because, for example, the weight and balance changes. You may have aircraft AFM supplements that you have to consider. So would you agree with this statement?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, there are a number of reasons for making sure things are documented. I mean, there insurance companies require that the aircraft technical record is accurate and current. So, I mean, if you install baskets and you make no entry of it, and the aircraft were to have an accident or an incident, the insurance company could say, hey, that it was flying in a configuration that was not recorded in the record, so the record was not current and it wasn't accurate, and so they're not liable, you know. And there are a number of reasons that, from a regulatory perspective, there has to be an audit trail. There has to be a record of how things were done, why they were done, when they were done, and so this is quite important. And there are a number of them. I mean, we'll get into some of these examples and explain why some of these things are important, but it's important to understand what the changes are from an operations perspective. I mean, if I'm a pilot and I get into the aircraft, I want to know if the configuration has changed since what I last understood it to be. So, you know, one example, and here we'll just get into some examples and then we'll talk about them. One example is for instance, with a Gulfstream G650. The aircraft weighs over 100,000 pounds, but there are some airports that limit noise restrictions or weight restrictions. So the way the type certificate holder, Gulfstream, manages that is you can embody what are referred to as aircraft service changes. And all the aircraft service change is there's a placard holder in the cockpit that maintenance installs, and then they make a record of that placard holder being installed. Well, the placard holder is part of one of several aircraft service changes that also include a placard. So with that aircraft, if the owner of the aircraft wants to go into an airport that has a restricted weight on the airfield, all the pilot has to do is take the placard that says that the maximum operational weight is 96,000 or 99,500 pounds and install that placard there and fly the aircraft to that limitation. That's as simple as it is. However, you've changed the configuration of the aircraft. There has to be a record in the technical record that the aircraft configuration has changed, and now the maximum limit and maximum weight on that aircraft is 99,500. Likewise, if maintenance were to embody that placard and they didn't make a record of it, now the pilot, if he's not cluing into the fact that that placard's different, you know, what tells him that it's changed, right? So, and then from a regulator's perspective, if I see that this aircraft went into an airport that had a limitation on landing weight, and there's no record of the landing weight ever being restricted by the placard, how did you do that? Because technically the maximum permissible landing weight or operational weight is more than what the placard should have said, right? So you get into
because then I suppose it affects practically how much load I can have on an airplane, whether it's my luggage or another person, right?
Fuel, luggage, passengers, whatever the case might be, the pilot has to have the ability to know that he needs to manage his load going into that airport, right? So that's a fairly simple one. And of course, I mean, one would ask, well, why can't a pilot just install that? It might be that a pilot can install the placard. I mean, clearly, physically, that's not a problem. However, it all boils down to the regulation that you're operating under. Some regulations will stipulate that that's a maintenance action. It requires a maintenance release, and only a maintainer, an approved maintainer, can do that. Other regulations may authorize a pilot through an organization or whatever the case might be to do those changes themselves. So, and of course, with that change, with this placard change, there's a related flight manual supplement for each placard that you install, and you install different placards for different reasons under different aircraft service changes. Now, one thing we didn't talk about with data is that a lot of these configuration changes are pretty much permanent embodiments, and they'll never change. Nothing ever changes. Now, with this is an example of, you may pull that placard out of there and revert back to the standard landing weight, Other changes I've seen where people embody a piece of equipment and then they want to remove that piece of equipment. But it's very, well, I won't say very, but it's rather unusual that an STC, for instance, has removal instructions for the STC. You always get installation instructions, but you seldom see removal instructions. And that's an important thing to remember, because removing a piece of equipment from an aircraft that's been riveted on or bolted on isn't as simple as just doing it. You're not necessarily restoring the aircraft to original. So we have to be careful about what data you use if in potentially removing the configuration item. Maybe we can talk about a couple other examples. I know you had what I think is a really good example with a small helicopter, an EC-130, where it had different roll equipment. So what kinds of things did you see?
Well, that was an interesting one because it came out from Airbus with a certain configuration, and then they decided to change the configuration right away, and they installed, for example, a heating system for the engine, for that type of engine, and that was a permanent one. Okay,
Right.
so the configuration changed from delivery plus this STC, so permanent, but then there were a lot of other things like bearpaw, basket, flotations that were not on camera. They were they had an STC to install the camera to do some videos and stuff like that, and those things can be installed and removed. There are simple
Right.
installations, simple removal instructions. So I had basically a weight and balance for all of these configurations. So I had to recalculate the weight and balance when they installed the heating system. And then I had one for the bearpaw, one for the cargo basket, one for the flotation, one for the camera. And with that also, we have to consider the minimum equipment list may change. The aircraft flight manual supplements may need to be inserted in the main AFM. So yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, for sure. Likewise, I had an operator in Canada here where they had, I think, 8 or 10 aircraft. Of course, helicopters in a mountain and a coastal environment have many different roles. I mean, one day they can be doing search and rescue, another day they can be doing heli skiing, they can be doing long lining. There's a number of things that a helicopter can be used. They're very versatile. And these helicopters were. So, going on site and asking to see the weight and balance on these aircraft, it was quite obvious from the logbooks and from the flight logs that the aircraft had been being used in numerous different roles, but there was no entries in the logbook that the roll equipment had been changed from day to day. And with that also, there were no changes to the weight and balance, and there was no mechanism for managing the weight and balance for these. So what ended up happening in the end, obviously they were apprised of the need to make the entries for the roll equipment changes, but also they had to come up with a mechanism for capturing, like you just mentioned, the configuration. And that was something that was actually quite an easy fix, but it was a tool that they had to come up with where for each aircraft, they had to come up with a separate set of weight and balance addendums. And every time a piece of roll equipment was embodied on the aircraft, they would have to make a log entry and reference that a new weight and balance sheet or addendum was in place. And what that does is, obviously, I mean, with any aircraft, it's critical, but with a helicopter, if you're operating in adverse conditions and you have different equipment on board, you want to know what your CFG is when you go flying, right? So that was just an example of that.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I was pointing the technical records part out just a few minutes ago, because I had the same issue. I really had a time make them understand that if you install the basket, you need to write on the technical log that you installed the basket, and now the weight and balance is this one, because the same thing happened to me. Like I said, I had different weight and balance amendment, and but it was a little difficult for them to understand that no, you have to write it down, because whoever comes needs to know that is flying in this configuration. These now are the limits. These are the conditions, and that is the AFM supplement that you have to look at. So
yeah, and that's partly why we're talking about this is to make people aware that it seems fairly straightforward and simple and but they're easy things to overlook, right?
yeah.
Another example, I had a AS-350 aircraft, a helicopter, where they did an engine conversion on the aircraft. And I mean, the engine conversion itself was recorded nicely in the logbook and everything. And there was an AFM supplement that went with it, and that was in there. And the aircraft had been operated for several years with that supplement, presumably, and with that engine configuration. But one day I was doing an inspection on it, and I asked to see the supplement, and I was comparing the engine instruments that were in the supplement with what was on board the aircraft, and they weren't the same instruments. What they forgot to do when they embodied the STC was change actually what it was the same instruments, but you had to send them out and have the faces remarked because the new engine had different parameter limitations. So what the aircraft had been flown with as a red line, for instance, on engine speed, wasn't the right engine speed. So they don't know. Perhaps they overtemp the engine or oversped the engine in certain instances, right? So again, these are things that have to be looked at. Another, I mean, we've got some examples that are more permanent. So I mentioned earlier, changing a Convair from a 580 to a 5800. Freighter passenger to freight conversions are a big one these days. So you've got a Boeing 737 that's hasn't got to the end of its life, but it's pretty tired, so it still has life in it. What a lot of owners, lessors, whoever, do is they make them into passenger to freight conversions. Now, this is pretty much a permanent conversion because I can't say that I've ever seen one make its way back into passenger life, but nonetheless, we're talking about major changes to the aircraft. Obviously, have to be done to approve data. I've seen everything changes. Completely new AFM, completely new weight and balance, of course, and all of these things. And those are very straightforward situations. Usually not a lot gets overlooked because everything is spelled out and it's so critical that everybody's paying strict attention to, right? But I've also seen, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And if I may, and those are the ones that are easier to manage on the long term, because now you just have one new configuration, but it's one. It's not like with kits where they can change continuously based on what you install. I find this one way easier to manage.
Oh, for sure. And that's the important thing for me from an operations perspective. That's where I've seen most of the glitches because they're so simple that they're overlooked, And so I think it's important for a pilot taking an aircraft from, even if there's a dispatch section in place with whatever organization they're flying with, it's important that everybody understands the criticality of all of this and their role in ensuring that the aircraft is what it's supposed to be, right? So,
yeah.
But an interesting one that I've seen quite recently is you may have a large, like an A330 Airbus that is in for maintenance and needs to be, it's being reconfigured for delivery to a new operator. Usually these are ferry flights. But so the configuration might involve completely new passenger seating, a completely new configuration of the passenger compartment. But they don't have the new seats yet. But they need to reposition the aircraft for, say, paint or other maintenance. So what happens in a situation like that is the operator will ask the continuing airworthiness management organization to approach the regulator and the type certificate holder about relocating the aircraft, flying the aircraft without seats altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Well, clearly that's a departure from the approved configuration. So one, we need approved data or supporting data from the type certificate holder. And so typically the CAMO or the maintenance provider, whoever's responsible, depending under the regulatory regime it's being operated, will approach the type certificate holder and ask them for support to fly the aircraft in the given configuration. And they'll be required to spell out exactly what the configuration of the aircraft is so that the type certificate holder can make a determination on whether that would be acceptable or not from safety point. And then being supported with that information, they would then approach the regulator for some sort of approval, some sort of flight authorization to fly the aircraft in that given configuration. And I mean, it's up to the authority. The authority can say, no, that still doesn't mitigate all of the risk that we feel is there. We need to see you, how are you going to address these items? And they can throw out other additional items out there. So, but it can be also as simple as yeah, you've got type certificate holder support that the aircraft's safe to fly in this state, in this configuration. So yeah, we'll accept it. But it's kind of a hybrid situation. But obviously, clearly, that would be also an example where there would have to be a weight and balance amendment because, you know, without all of the seats in the aircraft, what are your numbers, you know? And again, if you're ferrying the aircraft, might be long distances, you might be looking at ferry fuel, who knows what the situation is, but clearly, again, that would be a situation where it's much more regulated and controlled, and things usually don't slip under the carpet quite so easily. It's all of these really simple role-related and readily changeable configuration changes that tend to be the gotchas.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Okay, so I think we can wrap up this episode by saying that pay attention to configuration changes. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, just like when you say pay attention to configuration changes, I mean that applies to everybody. I mean, it affects the guy flying the aircraft. It affects the safety of the aircraft, and it affects the maintainers embodying these. It affects who can embody them. There are all kinds of details that have to be taken into consideration. So you just have to do exactly that and analyze the whole situation. Everybody should be involved in whether it's permissible to do some of these things or not.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, and I think we already discussed this example, but again, in another helicopter, I had the basket and the flotation, and the flotation STC said that the basket STC said that the basket installation was not compatible with flotation devices. So also this thing, you have to consider this thing. So again, those are all tasks that I think are part of what we call aircraft management. So the person who is responsible for aircraft management, whether he's a CAMO engineer, an aircraft maintenance engineer, should evaluate and make sure that everybody is on the same page. Like you said, pilots are affected because the weight and balance can change, the minimum equipment list can change, the FM can change. So it's all about safety at the end, right?
Yeah. Actually, you just brought up minimum equipment list, and absolutely. I mean, typically that's considered an air ops document, and if you're looking at some permanent configuration changes, that's one aspect that they will definitely have to be involved in, right? So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this was another very good one. I think we have still lots to say, but maybe we keep it for another episode.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to add also, I mean, we only threw out there a few types of different configuration changes. I mean, there I'm sure is a huge list of things that we didn't cover that you just have to be aware. If you're making a configuration change, there's more to it.
Yeah, for sure. And this would be a good example and a good opportunity for those of you who like this type of content to let us know that you like it, like, subscribe, and share, and leave a comment so that with questions, with your experience, so that we can talk more about this topic and expand our knowledge further on this topic. So, well, for now, thank you very much for watching this episode of Storytime with Bret. Remember to check out all the other videos that we have and our podcast, Aviation Perspectives with C.A.C, where we continue to talk about aviation-related topics with a lot of different guests. So check that out, subscribe, and see you next time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.